Hey everybody, I'm Pastor AJ Houseman and welcome to 10 Foot Pole, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 4, Episode 13. Today our guest is Jack Jenkins, who is a reporter for Religion News in D.C., and I brought Jack in today just to give us a general sort of state of the religious union. And he can laugh because there's a lot going on. Like Jack has been extremely busy since leading up to and then since the inauguration with our new administration. Is having a lot of very religiously charged things happening.
Yeah, you could say that. You could say that.
So tell us a little bit about what you've been covering lately.
What have I not been covering? Okay, so I think one of the things to keep in mind is that there have been religious factions in the different parties and in these different surrounding different candidates from different parties for quite some time, and then there are also just theological divisions in the United States that transcend party divisions that have also been around for quite some time. And when you have a shock to the system, which I think many people would argue Trump's election and then inauguration or re-election and then new inauguration have kind of had happen in the United States, a lot of those fissures reemerge. And I think, it is not lost on me that the first full day that Trump had in office, that first morning, when he went to the inaugural prayer service at the Washington National Cathedral, which has been happening for some time, that the different theological divisions in our country were made manifest in that moment.
Very, very instantly, right?
Yeah. And I will say,
I got to hear about the sin of empathy. And I was like,
right.
I didn't know that was considered a sin. That actually seems like a thing that Jesus is very for.
Yes. So it is that argument has also kind of emerged. I'll get around to that. So so the thing there is, I was there. I was one of the very few press that were there who wasn't like a photographer, who wasn't part of the traveling press pool that morning, precisely because, for those who aren't aware, there was a lot of headlines around Bishop Marian Budde, the Episcopal Bishop of Washington's sermon that she preached to Donald Trump that morning. And I was there precisely because I assumed that something like this might happen.
Yeah.
And for those of us who would spend a lot of time, covering religion, I knew Bishop Marian Budde, she had been critical of Trump in his first administration, particularly in his last year in office, following the clearing of Lafayette Square, this park right next to the White House, which that clearing of that and of protesters happened right before Trump walked across that field and held up a Bible in front of St. John's Church.
Yes.
The thing that people may not know is that among those who were forcibly cleared that day was actually a priest and a seminarian who were there at the behest of the diocese, at the behest of Bishop Marian Budde, who were also forcibly cleared from the church's patio. And she told me that night, and it had a lot of criticism for Trump at the time. And
right, so he just took it upon himself to, sort of, kind of, I guess, trespass on the church's property for his own purpose without any communication with the church itself.
There's the legal definition there. I leave to lawyers, but he did not ask permission. That much I know. And he did not. It was not like a request for him to come over there and do that. And I think the Bishop Marian Budde in particular did not take kindly to that at all.
Do you know if they sued?
The church did not sue. I actually asked them a lot about this. I defer to lawyers. I know there was some debate about whether or not the patio counts as the church's property. There's a lot of DC specific things about when federal property begins and ends. But I don't know why they ultimately decided not to sue. But what I will say is that I talked to the priest who is forcibly cleared, and her quote from that I remember to this day was that they turned holy ground into a battleground. And so with that context, when Trump was showing up for this worship service, I was kind of like, well, I wonder what Bishop Budde will say.
Yeah.
And and so when I was there, it was
On
like
real good
me.
terms with the Episcopal Church.
And so it was really interesting too because this inaugural prayer service had a lot of Trump's longtime evangelical supporters in the pews. Now I will note it was not full. My understanding, and people can correct me if I'm wrong on this, my understanding is Trump's team was actually in charge of the guest list, but they did
Okay.
not fill the church. They did not fill the cathedral. But you had a decent number of people there,
Hmm.
in addition to Speaker Mike Johnson. JD Vance and his family were sitting next to Trump and the First Lady. But then also there were Paula White, who now is running Trump's faith office in the
Yeah,
White
we're going to
House.
talk about that too.
And Sean Foyt, who's been a prominent activist, over the last few years. I could run down this list of prominent. Oh, and Robert Jeffress, who actually the first inauguration Trump had back in 2017, he preached a sermon to Trump that morning. I give all that because what happened at the end of her sermon, when Bishop Buddy concluded her sermon by making this plea that Trump should have mercy,
Yes.
was fascinating because if you really want to get nerdy about it, you could say that this was kind of the culmination of a century and a bit of debate within American Protestantism in particular,
Okay.
because you could go back to the fundamentalist modernist debate of the early 20th century, which is where we
Hmm.
got evangelicals, the modern parlance around that to
Hmm.
begin with, when there was a fissure where they said that were what people who then branded themselves as fundamentalists and wrote a document called the Fundamentals. They said that these modernist and
After the
liberal
monkey
Christians who
trials, right? Isn't that
well,
what it was called?
it was in the lead up to that, but the monkey trials were where I'll get to that in just a second. They had this division, particularly within Presbyterianism, but all the mainliners had this split where they were really frustrated with like people using the historical critical method to interpret the Bible, for instance,
Hmm.
the inculcation of any sort of a lot of science into theology, and there was a walkout at Princeton Theological Seminary where a whole subset of the conservatives left. And this repeated throughout versions of American Protestantism. And what we got was that this monkey trial happened and several other things happened, and liberal Christians won in the 20th century. And so the 20th century was in many ways, the ascendancy of liberal, quote unquote, and quote unquote modernist mainline Christians who
Hmm.
were the normative form of Christianity throughout the country, and particularly in the halls of power. And fundamentalists and evangelicals actually did not have that power. It wasn't until the very tail end of the 20th century that we saw the rise of the religious right.
Well, they
So
also
here
were
we
very
are.
unpolitical too, right? Like it wasn't until some guys got in a room and they're like, well, we have to figure out how to motivate and get this sector of Christianity to actually vote and take part in this.
There was a lot of talk around how, to your point, for instance, the Southern Baptist Convention's position on abortion before and after the Roe v. Wade decision, and how Southern Baptist pastors and conservative ministers suddenly leapt on that as a point of alliance with Catholics in
Hmm.
particular who had long opposed abortion, that and thus emerged the religious right that we came
Yeah,
to know
before
in the
that they didn't really care
1970s.
until it was like
Right.
made a point to them, oh, you should care about this.
And that it was absolutely used pretty overtly as a point
Yes.
of political inspiration. And so I thought about that while watching the sermon because here is a literal bishop in mainline Protestantism in the Episcopal Church, and the sermon was a plea for mercy. It wasn't really a fire and brimstone
Hmm.
homily that was condemning everything there, but kind of this plea for mercy for LGBTQ kids as well as immigrants and refugees. And the response from, I mean, one lawmaker who's conservative Christian walked out of the sermon, and others were leaving furious and like filmed themselves on their cameras as they did so after the service. Of course, Trump, later that evening on Truth Social, referred to Buddy as a so-called bishop and demanded an apology. Mike Johnson also, accused her of promoting radical ideology. There was actually a resolution introduced in Congress to condemn the sermon. It hasn't made it out of committee, but the net
Yes,
result of
showing
all of
mercy to
that,
people being persecuted is radical ideology. Comes
I
directly
mean,
from Jesus.
well, so your point is really good because I think this is what has been interesting about that moment is that there was a broad-based condemnation of Buddy's comments. People refer to her as radical. I should note that some of the Episcopalians who were conservative, who sent me statements, who were conservative members of Congress, who sent me statements critical of Buddy's sermon. In at least one instance, I also contacted their local bishop, who pushed back on the politician's criticism of Buddy,
Yeah.
right? And what has emerged since then is that one question I've had since then is that if Mike Johnson, for instance, believes that Buddy's sermon was evoking a radical ideology, or if these other lawmakers believe the same, I'm curious what they think about that was radical. Because since that sermon, we have had statement and lawsuit after lawsuit filed by a number of religious organizations throughout the country that seem to stake out a pretty specific a theological position that aligns very closely the one that Buddy preached, right?
Hmm.
We've now had since then a group of Quakers and the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship and a Sikh group have all filed a lawsuit pushing back against the ending of the sensitive locations memo, which
Hmm.
is this internal government memo that discourage immigration raids at hospitals, churches, and schools, sensitive locations. In the past, the Trump administration has rescinded this. That has been a lawsuit that has been filed. There's also been a lawsuit filed by three different groups that work with refugee resettlement, a Jewish group, a Lutheran group, and Church World Service. They have filed a suit claiming that um, is also an infringement on themselves. There's been another lawsuit on the sensitive locations memo that has been filed by 27 different religious denominations and associations,
Yeah.
again claiming violations of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act regarding the sensitive locations memo. And just this week, the United U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, which usually, if it's a big deal when they throw their hat into the ring, also filed suit over
Wow.
the ending of funding for refugee resettlement because
Yeah.
the USCCB also does refugee resettlement. That's coming alongside, I heard a bishop earlier this week, a Catholic bishop who chairs the migration committee in the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, referring to the Trump administration, talking about religious liberty. He said maybe they will do good things on religious freedom, but if, as he put it, if these are our friends, I would hate to see our enemies.
Mm.
Now, and then of course, I'm not even talking about the fact that JD Vance got in a fight with the Pope over like theology regarding immigration. I'm not talking about the
Yes.
fact that Elon Musk it seemed to platform an allegation that Lutherans were
Money
guilty of
laundering.
money laundering. And
Yeah.
again, if Bishop Buddy was promoting radical ideology, my question is that also true of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops? Is that also true of the 27 religious groups? Because when I spoke to Buddy, she was referencing several of the things that seem to have now be a part of active litigation between these religious groups and the Trump administration.
Yes, that's
So
very true. And so how how much of the executive orders are being challenged in court? 'Cause it's like almost
so
all of them, right?
A lot of them. There are some executive orders that are completely within the purview of the president. So, for instance, there's a whole slew of executive orders that's just rescinding executive orders that the former President Biden put forward.
Hmm.
Right? It's completely within the rights of Trump. There are some that are being litigated that a lot of analysts expect the courts will side with Trump on this, but there is a whole lot of them that they are people are skeptical that the Trump administration will win with regards to those. And let's be clear, I think one thing that became very difficult very early on for reporters and for activists to suss out is that there are things that were executive orders. There were things that the administration just did, right? Like the freezing of funds
Yeah.
for a lot of different organizations. There's the firings of people within various different government agencies. All of those are being litigated.
Yeah.
So I think I've lost track. There's a website that keeps track of all the lawsuits that have been filed. I think it's in the 60s. Someone can correct me on that.
Wow.
But it is a lot of lawsuits to go through pretty quickly on everything from the firings to these issues that touch on situations that are affecting faith groups, to the shuttering of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Things like that are all in court right now, and it is an open question whether or not Trump will get the victories that he wants when they come, if those end up coming before the Supreme Court.
Can you answer this question for me? Because it feels as though the administration is speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Like, this idea of reinstating this, the White House faith office and JD Vance going to a religious summit and saying that like one of the American qualities was religious freedom for everybody. But then on the other side of their mouth, what they're doing is condemning people like Bishop Buddy and promoting policies that are very anti-religious freedom.
So this is I think, a question that an existential question that kind of sits in from a religion and politics perspective that I think the Trump administration, has to grapple with or is grappling with, which is that, to your point, when I was watching JD Vance's speech at the International Religious Freedom Summit, there were many supporters in that room, and I spoke to a priest, an ACNA, an Anglican priest, right after his speech, who was very supportive of what JD Vance was talking about. JD Vance expressed religious freedom as a value for this administration. And he celebrated the actions of this priest celebrated the actions of Trump's administration in general. And so you did hear some of that applause. It is also true that as soon as he's finished his speech, somebody who was behind where the group of press were sitting, said loudly while walking past the press, that was gaslighting.
Yeah.
And then, shortly after the speech, while I was talking to people in the crowd, I spoke to an individual who lives in Sri Lanka, who works for an organization that works with persecuted Christians in that region. And he said, well, he's celebrating religious freedom, and that's great. And we hope that that continues to be the case, referring to the vice president. But the funds we use to do our work are USAID funds, and they are frozen.
Yeah.
And I checked in with him this week, and they remain frozen. And so that is religious freedom work that is not being done under this Trump administration. And and I should also note, it was interesting. And one of the people I spoke to, one of the
Well, even like everything down
co-sponsors,
to like making like the Ten Commandments and Bible stuff in public schools, right? Like that is promoting a particular religious ideology.
that is certainly
That
the
does not
position
speak of
of any
religious
number of
freedom.
that is certainly a position of any number. Like so for instance, in Louisiana, I believe you're talking about with putting the Ten Commandments on the wall. The position, the legal position against that is that privileges not only Christianity, but also, like, people argue, a specific kind of Christianity, because there are different actual translations of the Ten Commandments, right?
Yes, there are.
As I learned, there are even the different denominations number them differently. I only
That's true
recently learned
too.
in the last few years that Lutherans number them different
Mhm.
than we Presbyterians do. But so these are all things that, like, that matter quite a bit to these religious groups, and so privileging a specific translation is the argument of these the lawyers for these various groups say that what's happening in Louisiana is privileging one specific religious tradition. And I should note, one thing that I found interesting in JD Vance's speech at the International Religious Freedom Summit, an argument that did not sit well with one of the sponsors of the summit, the Christians for Middle East Peace. I spoke to the executive director of that after the speech. She noted and was particularly frustrated by Vance's argument that religious freedom comes from Christianity. That because
Yeah.
in that speech he argued that it was Christianity was who gave religious freedom as a concept to the planet. That is disputed by many historians and advocates. But that would, if he even if he felt it was on solid footing, it is an interesting choice to make that argument at
Yeah.
an International Religious Freedom Summit, right? During, like, in a speech from the vice president. And I think that
Yeah.
has been something that I think a lot of people have kind of, taken a step back and watched. Like the fact that JD Vance, for instance, was so insistent that this argument that he made regarding justifying the Trump administration's immigration policy, for instance, he has
Yes.
argued, and he's argued this since the campaign, because I went to an event in which he made this argument, that it's a Christian principle that you take care of your family first and then your neighborhood and what have you. And he
Hmm.
extrapolates that to mean, thus, Trump's immigration policies, which have called for mass deportation, which have allowed for at least one arrest outside or an attempted entry into a church in Atlanta, reportedly. Those sorts of policies are in keeping with what he calls a Christian concept. He is now attached to that he believes it specifically is Ordo Amoris, which is this specific
Yes.
concept that he's
It is a
attaching that idea to.
Catholic concept.
He argued that, and he very much made fun of a person on the internet who was like fighting with him about this, saying you should just Google this. Right now, a few days later, the Pope sent a
Yep.
letter to bishops specifically refuting that interpretation of Ordo Amoris, right? So
Yes.
the Pope of the Catholic Church refuted the vice president's theology on this.
Yeah.
And it's just an interesting question of like of why JD Vance is making these arguments in public. Why is he think it important to justify the Trump administration's policies using his interpretation of Catholic theology in particular, even if he's fighting with the Pope over it? What is this administration's posture towards people of faith, or specific people of faith whose beliefs might butt up against the policies of this administration?
Yeah, it almost feels like there is this innate need to find justification, right? Because it's not biblically justified.
I mean, I think what I think is interesting. So that argument I just talked to you about, the Ordo Amoris one, that whole
Hmm.
Christian concept. When I went to this JD Vance campaign event during the campaign last year, before JD Vance got on stage, I was talking to people in the crowd, and I should note that this event was associated with Lance Wallnau, which is a whole nother rabbit hole I can get into, but he is a longtime supporter of the president. He comes from the more charismatic Pentecostal Christian tradition.
Okay.
He prophesied Trump's victory back in 2016. And he is a self-described Christian nationalist. And so that was the tenor of this event before Vance got on stage. And I was asking people in the room about, what were then Trump's proposed policies regarding immigration, or just like Trump's proposed policies in general. And at least one person in the crowd argued something very similar to what JD Vance ended up arguing on the stage later about that Christian concept of taking care of your own family or your own house first. And I would argue that on the one hand, there like the Pope has rejected that as an interpretation of that concept, or JD Vance's concept. Any number of other religious groups have rejected it. But it is interesting to me that was already extant in that community, right?
Okay.
That those ideas have floated around in certain conservative Christian circles here in the United States. For how long is an interesting question, but they certainly were already there. It was JD Vance speaking into something, which I thought was interesting for a variety of reasons, because I think a lot of people would argue that they were not necessarily the prevailing theology of American Christianity for at least the last century, if not before. So I think that's kind of a piece that we're starting to see a lot of, is that Trump's religious coalition is very much a coalition. Something I'm working on right now is that there's actually some tensions around putting Paula White back in charge of the faith office, for instance,
Yeah.
because there's certain subsets of Trump's conservative Christian base that actually don't believe in women's ordination in general. So they challenge her on one principle and also don't like her theology. And so it's not a uniform entity to begin with, but what they can agree on is often opposition to liberals and progressives and liberal and progressive theologies. And again, speaking only about American Protestantism, that's about a century and a bit in the making, and that fight does not seem to be going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I struggle with the why is this concept of showing love and humanity so radical? Like such a quote liberal ideology.
Well, I mean, so you brought up the sin of empathy, right? That concept. Well, and I think
Which I
promoters
didn't
of
know was a
that
sin until someone posted that.
Well, I think promoters of that theology argue it's been around for a long time. I will note that that term and that kind of the popularization in certain circles of that term is only about 4, 5, 6 years old. It's attached specifically to an individual named Joe Rigney as well as Doug Wilson, who's an Idaho pastor, and they kind of it digs deeper than the term, as it were, but it is interesting to me that that theology has suddenly gotten some attention, right? And an ideology attached to that, because there's the theological argument that empathy is a sin, and then there's this other ideology that empathy has been a way that the left has co-opted the right, that they can use empathy as a way to like steer conservatives in a direction they don't want to go. And regardless of how you feel about that, it results in things like, you may have seen this video that the White House put out in the last week, in which it was shots of what they said were immigrants who were being deported, put on a plane to be
Hmm.
deported. And there was no dialogue. It was just the sounds of people being shackled and escorted on to a plane. And the White House described it as ASMR, which for those of you who are not aware of that, that is a subcommunity of where you listen to people who find certain sounds pleasurable,
Hmm.
or that the White House was describing the deportation of people, the sounds of deporting people as a pleasurable noise, right? And
That
people
just
have
like that just gave me goosebumps of how much that like just shakes me to the core to think about that. That's oh, okay. Continue.
And so there was no shortage of religious pushback to that, who described that and other aspects of the Trump administration as cruel, right? And I should note the deportation numbers are not necessarily dramatically higher right now than they are normally. But I think a lot of what Trump's critics have argued is that the posture of Trump administration right now is one in which there's sort of celebration of things that people in the past would not have necessarily celebrated, right, or been enthusiastic about.
Yeah.
And JD Vance's posture on some of this, Trump himself, his posture on some of this, isn't, well, this is really hard and difficult, but it's just something we need to do. It's enthusiasm for a
Yeah.
lot of these things that some people, or even people who support it, might be uncomfortable with. And I think and it should be noted, before Trump was inaugurated, supporters of him, such as Charlie Kirk, who is a big booster of his, who runs Turning Point USA, were saying to supporters, and someone can find the specific quote about this, but my understanding is that he was saying, they're gonna during the deportation, they're gonna find people who are crying and upset about this, and we can't let them control the narrative. It was this understanding that the human reality of a lot of policies may be unpopular, and we need to do our best to combat that ahead of
To
time.
reframe it so
And
it
and
seems like a good
so
thing.
yeah, whether the sudden popularization of quote unquote sin of empathy and things like that is
Can you explain
organic
that
or
further? Like
intentional.
what is the theology behind the sin of empathy?
I would like to tell you at length. I'm only just beginning my research on that topic. It was not something I was familiar with, frankly. I'd heard whispers of it, but I didn't really understand that there was like there was a book coming out by that person I mentioned, Joe Rigney, called "The Sin of Empathy," and there's a podcast that he did, I think, believe back in 2018 with Doug Wilson that has the same name, where they unpack that. I would defer you to that right now. I wouldn't feel uh, uh, enough of an expert on the theology to describe it adequately. But again, I think it comes to this. It comes back to this idea that these are um, there is a concern in those camps that seems to be shared with um, people in other camps, that empathy can be used by the left to coerce the right, and that it's like a tool as opposed to a human reaction, right?
Hmm.
And or a theological imperative, which I think would be the argument of several of the detractors here.
Yeah.
Um, And and those are different theologies. Those are different positions. And I think that in my work as a reporter, it is really striking how farther and farther apart these different religious communities are getting around these specific instances. I'll say, covering Catholicism in particular, it's been interesting because the USCCB is also very happy about at least a couple of the executive orders that the president has signed. But the the impact on immigrants, communities that they both serve and occupy their pews, both in the United States and around the world, I think has been difficult for them to ignore. And the theological justifications behind it, I think, have really spurred Catholic bishops to be louder and bolder about these sorts of things than I have seen them in my career.
Wow.
Um, and so that's all relative. I should note, like there's an interesting dynamic of like the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and Catholic bishops in general. You rarely see them at a protest. That is relatively rare to see a Catholic bishop in full regalia at a protest, the same way you might see any number of Protestants
Hmm.
of multiple different religious persuasions, at an act of protest. So the fact that the USCCB is filing a lawsuit is not small,
Mm.
just given their relative reticence when it comes to how they operate in the political sphere. It's more statements and behind the scenes than physically putting themselves out there, as it were.
Yeah. So that's a lot different.
And I mean, and it is, this is really fascinating from a religion and politics perspective because it starts to get into, discerning where what the religious landscape looks like in this country because Trumpism really has long complicated what it means to be an evangelical, for instance, right? Like back when Trump was for running the first time, Russell Moore then the head of the
Hmm.
ERLC, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, the political arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. By now, he and Christianity Today, the magazine Christianity Today, which was founded specifically to counter the Christian Century, the liberal Christian magazine back in the 20th century, Christianity Today was seen as this flagship publication of evangelicalism. Now, Russell Moore is no longer a Southern Baptist,
Yeah, he
and
got exiled.
he is the editor in chief of Christianity Today, which has been derided by any number of conservative evangelicals as now this like kind of this liberal publication. So, where we stand as a country, where what theologies are given power, is really different. And just to close this thought, I've mentioned Doug Wilson several times here. And Doug Wilson has risen and fallen in terms of prominence over the last 30 years in different times. But over the last 4 years, 4 or 5 years, he really has started to show up more and more. His theology has long been controversial, including within evangelicalism. But now, this did not get much attention during the nomination hearing for a variety of reasons. But now, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth attends a church in Tennessee that is part of the denomination that Doug Wilson co-founded. Doug Wilson, again, is a self-described Christian nationalist. A position of the denomination is that women should not serve in combat. Hegseth is not necessarily tied his theology to those positions, but that is the kind of church that he attends every
Hmm.
Sunday, and he is now in charge of the U.S. military. And I don't think even a couple years ago people would have thought of Pete Hegseth as a contender to run the Defense Department to begin with. But now we have that kind of theology at least being listened to by the person in charge of the nuclear arsenal. And that is just a different theological landscape in terms of what theologies have access to power than was true even 4 years ago, much less 8.
So where does that leave us with some of these things?
I mean, for conservative Christians, one, I don't want to downplay the fact that there is actually a lot of internal tension within because it is a coalition. There is actually significant theological divisions between Pentecostals and Charismatics and Calvinists and Southern Baptists that have kind of been glossed over because due to the creation of a coalition around Trump. But I do think that we are, and there is tension even with the fact that, say, Elon Musk is now such a prominent part of the Trump administration. Elon
Hmm.
Musk describes himself as a cultural Christian, um, and but has stopped short of actually professing a belief in God. His numerous children via different partners is controversial in some conservative circles. And so how that coalition on its own has tensions within it. I think it
Well, how do they
maintains,
not have those same issues with the president?
well, this is an interesting question. There has historically been a lot of theology on the right, particularly in charismatic Pentecostal contexts, that have framed Trump as kind of a Cyrus figure. They think, God can use imperfect vessels. That has long
Okay.
been the argument, and that has also been attached to Musk. Also, but quite frankly, a lot of times I'm not even hearing people articulate their theology. They'll just say things like, if folks who normally would have had to specify a specific theological position, they'll just say things like, yeah, I don't necessarily like his personal life, but I really like what he's doing to the federal government,
Got it.
and just jumping over the theology altogether. Um, and so with that in mind, you know, what conservative Christianity is and wants to be, particularly when you have so many Catholics in those circles as well, who are now, even more heated fights with the Pope. Um, that is that remains a live wire, right? The USCCB filing a lawsuit against Trump, given the conservative Christians that they represent
Hmm.
in the United States, is a point of tension within that community. Meanwhile, this is an interesting moment for liberals and moderate and progressive Christians in the country, right? The 27 groups coming together to file a lawsuit against the Trump administration. That's not something we've seen in a long time. With that level of sophistication, partnering with Georgetown University in terms of crafting that legal argument. That is the mainline Christianities, not just mainline Christianity, but mainline Christianity in particular, enjoying more prominence, frankly, than they've had in a long time. The fact that people were buying T-shirts with Bishop Buddy's name on it and with
Yep.
Lutheran social services on it, that is a moment that we have not seen, and it's in American history. And so I have heard anecdotally that this has led to a spurt in attendance in a lot of these kinds of churches,
Hmm.
right? Whether that maintains, I don't know. We also saw a similar spurt right after Trump was elected the first time, and that did not necessarily maintain. But, it is not lost on me that going into Trump's inauguration, a thing we heard from a lot of progressive activists was that there was just a lot of exhaustion, right? And that when Trump was elected the first time, the next day was the Women's March, right? We were like thousands of people were out. There were the widespread protests, and that
Hmm.
just wasn't the case when Trump got inaugurated this time. But I have heard prominent voices say, because Bishop Buddy's sermon got national attention, because there were suddenly the Quakers filed a lawsuit, because Musk attacked the Lutherans, right? That this has actually spurred a lot of progressive activism writ large, and in both within the religious communities and outside of it. And that now we're seeing protests throughout DC and in other parts of the country opposing Trump and Elon Musk's agenda. And the fact that religious groups are such an integral part of that, I think, is really interesting, and that it's creating alliances that we haven't seen in a while between different religious groups. I think, insofar as Trump and these various different theologies have attained power, they have also, in many ways, energized a broader coalition of progressive and liberal, and also simply, conservative or moderate Christians and other religious traditions who simply don't support what he's doing. So that is a fight. That is a fight of theology, of policy, of legal precedent. That I will note some of the folks listed on the complaint by the USCCB are people who clerked for very conservative Supreme Court justices, right? So these are further divisions
Hmm.
in American politics that don't necessarily right now add up to long-term support for Trump's agenda. And I'm curious as to what happens moving forward as the policies continue to get enacted if the fallout from those policies isn't overwhelmingly felt to be positive, whether more people join the ranks of people like Bishop Buddy, people like
Hmm.
um, Bishop Eaton, head of the LCA, people like Bishop Barber, who I should note, it was actually preaching a sermon critical of the administration right before the inauguration, like literally minutes before he was preaching a sermon.
Yeah.
We see a lot of. I'm curious what that looks like in a year from now.
Yeah.
So.
What do you have a sense of like what the average, churchgoer where they're sitting with all of this?
Yeah, I mean, we
Because
we
I think
we
sometimes
have.
that there's this impression, right, that like from both sides, right, that like both, if you're thinking like from a more liberal, progressive, mainline Protestant side, we just assume, that like all all of the evangelicals are like crazy Trumpies and, believe all of these bad things. And then on the other side, they believe that all those people over there in the Lutheran Church are, corrupt, so woke that they've lost sight of Jesus and stuff and all of that. Like, do we like that's what you hear in the media, right? But like, what do we know where like the average churchgoer is actually sitting with any of this?
Yeah, so like we know that there isn't majority support in the United States for immigration raids on churches. There's a couple of polls indicating that. There just isn't. Um, and
That it's
nationally
bad,
speaking,
right? The majority of churches say, no, that's bad.
yeah, that they do not support allowing immigration officers to raid churches. That there's not majority support for that, for instance. Um, and we know that, I mean, I was speaking to the evangelical group that helps resettle refugees. I was speaking to an official at that organization recently. And he kind of talked about the disconnect that he sees, where on the one hand, you aren't seeing a lot of prominent evangelicals rush to that previously had championed, for instance, the plight of persecuted Christians. You do not see a lot of those figures rushing to the defense of refugee resettlement orgs that resettle refugees who were fleeing religious persecution, including persecuted Christians here in the United States, and how that is can be frustrating for a lot of these groups that rely on that that previously were glad to be celebrated in that regard. But what he was saying is that it is also true that they've had while the government money has immediately dried up and they do not think that they're going to be able to make that back from any other source, they
Hmm.
have been surprised by how much money they have been able to raise. And this is the evangelical group from evangelicals who say, like, yeah, we'll give you what we can, and they don't think they're going to be able to match what they had before. Layoffs are
Hmm.
happening in that organization as well as this. For those who don't know, out of the 10 groups that resettle refugees here in the United States, 7 of them are faith-based, including 2 that are evangelical. And those they're saying that they were kind of they know that polling indicates high levels of support in evangelical congregations for the work that they do.
Hmm.
And we also see actually like in a lot of polls, uh, a lot of the disposition of the average Christian in the United States, particularly the average Christian, but even in some evangelical circles, is actually significantly to at this point the left of what the Trump administration is advocating for. So one of the single most popular policies that he's advocating for is there is a surprising level of support for actually a lot of deportations in general. But when you ask more specifically what that would mean for certain kinds, what would deportation look like for these kinds of people, you find the support suddenly fall off a cliff in a lot of these spaces. So,
Well, does that
this
just
is
have more to do with
where
like people not fully thinking it through?
I mean, one thing about polling is you never quite understand what folks mean by that. But for instance, when you're saying, okay, what do you think about deportation? People are like, all right, I'm using this as a theoretical example. They're like,
Hmm.
actually, I support that. You're like, okay, well, do you care if they're like violent criminals or not? Like, would you want just violent criminals, or would you want anybody? Like, oh, I mean, yeah, I would probably actually want violent criminals. Let's prioritize that, right?
Hmm.
And so you start. There's several different polls that indicate that like step down, where by the time you get to the end, they're really only supporting mass deportation of a specific subset of Americans. And there's actually a lot more tolerance for people who have been here for a long period of time, for instance, who don't have a criminal history, who might be seeking asylum, for instance, which is a legal way,
Hmm.
a form of immigration. Um, that when you get into the nitty gritty here, there's a lot more variability in terms of how people, even conservative evangelical Christians, conservative Catholics, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, there's a lot more variability there than the top lines would have you believe.
Hmm.
So.
And another question along those lines. So I know, part of both the campaign and then what the administration is like focusing on had a lot to do with really pushing this illegal immigration thing and deportations and that, people are pouring over the borders and stuff like that. Is any of that actually true?
So, I'm not an immigration expert, but um, it is the case that there has been an increase in immigration in general for quite some time. And I will note that there's a bit of a disconnect that I've noted in my reporting. The first uh, feature I wrote as a journalist was I went down to the U.S.-Mexico border and visited a respite center set up by a Catholic church along the border for people who had been processed by Customs and Border Protection, and they were going to be dropped off at a bus site and given a ticket to go where they were going to stay. But this church set up a place where they could come, their kids could get new clothes. This was
Yeah.
during what was called the child migrant crisis. At the time, it was primarily women and their kids who were being dropped off at this church. And conservatives were very supportive of this. When I was there, Glenn Beck and Ted Cruz and two or three other Republican members of the Texas congressional delegation were all there. Like Glenn Beck was giving this church clothes and celebrating their work. And now Catholic Charities is one of the groups impacted by the Trump administration's actions. There has been, in general, at different points over the last 10 years, waxes and wanes of significant immigration. But uh, whether or not that is a manageable problem in the way that the Trump administration has responded to it, to say, for instance, one of the things I've heard from a myriad of activists, including some of Trump's evangelical supporters, is that the real answer to immigration would be to pass comprehensive immigration reform in Congress. In fact,
Hmm.
some of the Hispanic evangelical advisors to Trump that I've spoken to, when asked about Trump's policies, they will consistently put the onus on Congress and not Trump, saying it's up to Congress to actually pass any sort of legislation that might, for instance, up number of immigration judges and what have you. And we should note that there was bipartisan legislation that was potentially on the table within the last
Yeah.
2 years to handle this. And there's reporting that Trump himself may have interjected and squandered that opportunity from the perspective of the lawmakers who were co-sponsoring it for, again, according to reports, for political gain. So whether or not this really was an issue of immigration that could not be handled, or if this was something that benefits a specific political party or political candidate, I think is something that a lot of analysts have some very strong takes on. And reality is that it has been a popular position for Trump, even though we should note this during the campaign, there was a whole dialogue around hatred of migrants in Ohio from JD Vance that proved to be flatly untrue.
Yeah.
Um, but they persisted in telling that story, and I think part of the reason is the idea of immigration as this overwhelming force impacting our society is a very powerful one for a number of voters. And so, again, efforts by government to manage it, or whether or not it is anywhere close to the volume that they have described it as, are secondary to the politics around immigration, if that makes any
Yeah.
sense.
That does make sense. Yeah, I'm just trying to wrap my head around just kind of like what's happening because it feels like we just have like this whole firestorm of things that are happening. And I like, is it meant to manipulate us? Is it meant to scare us? Is it meant to distract us from something else that's happening? Just trying to figure out what's going on and what we should or should not be paying attention to.
I mean, I think it, at some level, the fact that Trump has issued so many executive orders, right? And as mentioned earlier, some of those are virtually universally agreed upon as things that he can do via executive order, and a whole lot of them are ones that people are not sure that he could actually do via executive order. Part of that is to you know make there's a political strategy that many analysts have pointed out of you show that you're doing a lot on the front end and you try to shore up as much support as you can and political clout as you can because what's coming is a big battle in Congress over the budget, and the budget is like where the money goes, right?
Hmm.
And there's also litigation in Congress about whether or not Trump and Musk can do the things that they're doing against these elements of the federal government, gutting them. Essentially, it is the argument of any number of the legal argument for reported by many of Trump's detractors is that the executive branch, the president, can't just get rid of a federal agency that was created by Congress. That's the
Hmm.
role of Congress. This is their argument. But it is still the budget and what money gets spent where that I think will probably have as much, if not more, of an impact in terms of the staying power of several of Trump's efforts and the far-reaching impact on the average American's life, right? Because as big as the federal government is, and as big as the gutting of it is in terms of staffing,
Hmm.
the other 320 million Americans may not necessarily feel that every day, but the federal budget may very well, if there are, depending on how Congress comes down on funding for Medicare and Medicaid, depending on how they come down on funding for different policies as part of the social safety net, for instance, if there really is the gutting of those, those are gonna have be felt very quickly by an even larger number of Americans. And so I think the ability for the average activist, for instance, to have much of an effect on Trump's thinking, I think is limited.
Yeah.
But that's what I'm hearing from activists. But a lot of those activists are more concerned. These are liberal and progressive activists are more concerned about the budget, and so too are a lot of conservative activists who see that as this is the final step. If we can win there, then this vision for America that has been a part of the Make America Great Again movement can actually become enshrined, which is why a lot of people are asking for so much synergy between Republicans in Congress and Trump's agenda. Because if they can get that, then they can have the kind of lasting power they actually want.
Hmm. And is this like budget cuts and stuff like they're talking about eliminating the Department of Education?
Right, and only Congress could do that technically.
Yeah.
Now, the argument for some is that Trump could just gut it to such a degree via the executive branch that it's effectively shut down, right?
Hmm.
And there's the legal argument as to whether or not he can even do that. But yes, like if I right now I'm not hearing Congress necessarily draft legislation or broad-based support in Congress to in the Department of Education right now. That doesn't mean that's not coming down the pike. Um, and
What's
I
the
think that there
motivation
will
behind that? I actually like legitimately don't understand.
The argument I hear from any number of conservatives is that it's a long-standing argument about local government and how states should be in charge of education, not the federal government. Um, there is also elements folks would prefer private schools have a broader presence in the U.S. education system than they currently do. And there's a lot of conservative support for private schools. I don't totally understand Trump's position on why he wants to get rid of the Department of Education. There's a lot of conversation around DEI and allegations that the Department of Education is woke, for instance.
Mm.
I don't know if enough about his education policy other than what he said in his speeches as to why specifically he wants it to be done away with. But what I have heard for a long time is just this argument that among conservatives who view it as an impediment to the education they would want their children to have, either at a private school or at a local public school, that they would like to have more control over, if that makes any sense.
Okay. I just Some of the argument doesn't like make sense to me, right? Like you've always had control over your child's education, right? If you ever don't want your child to learn about something, you don't have to. That's never, it's not like they've ever been, forcibly doing. Like I have a friend who never took a standardized test. Um, which again, so we grew up in Iowa, right? Like we're the home of standardized testing. And her mother is a professor of education at the University of Iowa and is just to the core against standardized testing. So her children never had to take them.
Yeah, I think the conservative argument I've heard for a long time, one, the religion and politics reporter, there's a lot of conversation around prayer being removed from schools and how they would prefer that there would be a larger religious presence in schools. That's what we're seeing in Louisiana. That's what we're seeing
Mm-hmm.
in Oklahoma. Um, but that just the curriculum itself, people say, can be evidential of a more liberal worldview than they would want their child um, to experience. I mean, I should know that this is happening alongside, this conservative Christian school movement, the classical Christian school movement. That actually the reason I mentioned him before, Pete Hegseth, according to him, the reason he moved to Tennessee was specifically to put his kids in a classical Christian school there. And he wrote a whole book about education that people kind of forget about now because it was not related to, the military, which is what he ends up being in charge of. But a couple of years ago, he wrote a whole book about how the education system has drifted into oblivion and how, according to him, and how you would want to put your kids in these kinds of schools so that they could be future cultural warriors, is how he put it.
Oh.
So, which is different than what the public education system is expected to do. I'm so sorry. Mac is losing his mind upstairs. I don't know if I go much longer. I can go. So,
That's fine. It's all good.
okay.
You've talked for a while, and I very much appreciate it. And you can get to your sweet little baby and stuff. So thank you, Jack, so much for joining us on this and telling us all of these things. I appreciate your insights and everything that you can share with us. For those of us that are just trying to figure out what's going on and where we're supposed to be and stand as Christians these days. So thank you so much. You can leave and I'll finish up my speech is totally fine.
I apologize. I thought the nap would go longer, but no worries.
No, listen, I've been there many times on these kind of calls, so I totally understand. You go for it. Thank you so much. For everyone, you can learn more about the podcast at the 10footpolepodcast.com and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10footpole podcast and wherever you listen to podcasts. And as always, remember that the 10 Foot Pole Podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care, y'all.